welcome to ABP Live. I have with me a special guest, Mark Linscott. He was the Assistant U.S. U.S. Trade Representative under Donald Trump's previous administration. He has also represented United States at the World Trade Organization. We are going to understand from him what is it that India and U.S. can see in terms of a bilateral trade agreement, which was agreed when Prime Minister Narendra Modi was there in Washington, D.C. recently, and what is it about reciprocal tariffs that India needs to learn about. Welcome to ABP Live, Mr. Linscott, and thank you for giving us your time.
Thank you so much, Nayanima. It's a pleasure to see you.
Thank you. So let me start from, the joint statement and what both the leaders, when they met recently, what they talk about was about a bilateral trade agreement. Now, we know during the first term of President Trump, we were looking at a mini trade deal followed up with a larger trade deal, but, nothing eventually turned out. So right now, do you see a BTA is possible, and the deadline that President Trump has given is, before the fall?
Yes, in fact, well, going back to the first Trump administration and the reference you made to the efforts to negotiate a mini deal related to India's GSP benefits, the Generalized System of Preference, and its beneficiary status under that. Yeah, it was described as mini, but it in fact was going to be quite substantial. I think we'd calculated at the time that it could have covered roughly $10 billion in bilateral trade. It covered a number of sectors, and the two sides got very close. There was a lot of progress, a lot of traction on issues, and it was a real disappointment at the time that they were not able to conclude the agreement. So I certainly was very pleased to see the outcomes in the joint statement during Prime Minister Modi's visit. As you highlight, it calls for a bilateral trade agreement. It does not say an FTA, it's a BTA. And it is to include a first tranche of outcomes by sometime this fall. And presumably, after that, negotiations will continue on a larger BTA, I assume into 2026 and beyond. And I'm quite hopeful. I think the moment is right. The points of leverage are clear, and frankly, it's overdue for the two sides to come together and do something significant on the economic and trade front.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting that you spoke about the mini trade deal and, which was there agreed in the last tenure. And I remember speaking to you at that time in 2019, 2020. But then in this present situation, and also concerning the fact that there has been a pandemic and there are these two wars going on, there is a supply chain issue globally that is going on. What do you think the BTA can cover? I believe, yes, there'll be low-hanging fruits followed probably by an FTA. But what are the areas do you think can be those low-hanging fruits when it comes to US-India trade? Because India has already reduced tariff on some of the items like bourbon whiskey and, other items.
Yeah, and I think it's important that you highlighted what has taken place in the interim since those first efforts under the first Trump administration with COVID and the war in Ukraine. It certainly makes a bilateral trade agreement even more compelling between the two countries. Okay. Well, the joint statement itself highlights that it will be multi-sectoral. It will cover goods and services. It obviously will cover tariffs. I expect a wide range of non-tariff barriers, like trade restrictive standards and technical barriers will be covered. I assume intellectual property rights will be in the picture. And in terms of sectors, I think almost any sector in which there's bilateral trade or the potential for bilateral trade could be covered. So agriculture, as a good example. In fact, the two sides have been working on agriculture over recent years, and even during the Biden administration, and made some modest outcomes in that area. Certainly high tech. this will be a priority. Information and communication technologies,
Mhm.
maybe even AI and quantum. It's not clear what might be done in those areas, and to the extent there are trade restrictions that actually impact those areas. Certainly digital services. This is, I think, a key area to be covered in the negotiation. As you know well, India has not been a participant in the WTO negotiation on a plurilateral agreement, the so-called Joint Statement Initiative on e-commerce. I think this is the opportunity for the two sides to get together bilaterally and hash out some rules of the road on digital trade. So I think it will be wide ranging, and almost any sector is fair game.
Mhm. Well, I'll come to the WTO aspect as well, but before that, let me also understand from you, and for the benefit of our viewers, when we talk about a $500 billion bilateral target, this is not something new that has been achieved. I remember this was spoken about during the Obama administration when Prime Minister Modi was there. So it's been like more than 10 years, but that $500 billion target has not been met. Do you think it'll take us another decade to achieve that? How is that possible?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And frankly, I'm a skeptic on any effort to identify a specific number and highlight that as a goal. I think what's more important is that the two sides have established the circumstances, the conditions for negotiating a wide-ranging bilateral trade agreement. If it's a meaningful agreement, if it covers a lot of different sectors, if it goes deep in terms of lowering tariffs and lowering non-tariff barriers, and committing to certain international best practices, whether it's trade facilitation or good regulatory practices, then we will have good prospects to eventually hit 500 billion in trade. But it's in some respects, it's just pulling a number out of a hat, and one that's been identified many times in the past. What is more important is creating the conditions that can expand trade and eventually get to that level. It could be another decade. I think it will be less. Certainly, if it's a strong, meaningful agreement, it will be less. Hopefully, it will be 5 years. I mean, it's just hard to tell at this point in time.
Mhm. Now, also coming to the fact that, when we talk about what is it that the US wants from India, it's really not clear either from the government side or, from our trade negotiators' point of view. So, what exactly do you think the US would be wanting India to do in the first leg of the trade deal, apart from reducing tariffs, which is already happening in a way?
Yeah, well, in fact, I think tariffs will be central. I mean, there's just no escaping that. That will be the number one priority on the U.S. side, going beyond bourbon, going beyond motorcycles. I mean, those were very limited. They were welcome tariff concessions that, in fact, had been laid out in Finance Minister Sitaraman's budget earlier this year. But I think they want to go much further, certainly in seeking more reciprocal tariffs in key sectors, agriculture, automobiles, auto parts, a number of manufacturing sectors. So tariffs will be part of that first tranche, I'm confident. If there aren't additional agreements on tariffs, then I don't think we'll have a first tranche. I think what would be interesting then is to what extent can they at least preliminarily move into negotiations on non-tariff barriers.
Yes.
And certainly both sides have issues with agriculture trade, with sanitary and phytosanitary standards, and some of the impacts, the negative impacts SPS measures can have on trade. I could see those being part of a first tranche, at least for certain agriculture products. On the U.S. side, there's been a lot of discussion and concern expressed about some of the quality control orders in place, which I think for the most part serve very important purposes of ensuring quality of products and protecting health, human health and lives.
Mhm.
But there are aspects of them that appear to be more protectionist than serving legitimate objectives. And in fact, these are issues that have been raised in the WTO, not only by the United States, but by a number of India's other trading partners. So if they could at least bite off a small chunk of the quality control orders and get some agreement on that, it would be ideal. I think the biggest, beyond tariffs, the biggest opportunity in a first tranche, before the end of this year, is to try to do a digital services agreement, whether it's a chapter, whether it's a side agreement. I think that would be an ideal scenario, a very welcome result, and certainly would do more in covering services than almost any other sectoral negotiation in the BTA.
Hmm. And also, if I can ask you, in today's America, how important it is, as we saw in the first tenure of President Trump, on having more market access in India as far as pharmaceuticals and medical devices are concerned. Also, we see now, and there's a commentary going on in India, is the fact that US might address the reciprocal tariff issue with India by boosting defense trade. The discussions going on in India where the F-35 fighters will be offered and many other things. So, do you think these two aspects are also going to be important?
Yeah, on the pharmaceuticals and medical devices question, and broadly the health sector. In fact, there's healthy bilateral trade between the two countries in these sectors. Certainly India's had tremendous success in exporting generic pharmaceutical products to the United States to the tune of, I think, 8 billion or so annually. It's been a huge success story, and that trade should continue. And in reverse, the U.S. pharmaceutical manufacturers have been very successful in the Indian market. In fact, I think the U.S. manufacturers' top priority is probably intellectual property rights, and there's been a lot of progress, frankly, on IPR reform in India. But I think more work between the two sides in that specific area could increase bilateral trade in the health sector. Medical devices, I think there's essentially a truce that's been in place since the first Trump administration on pricing of medical devices, but there are still challenges in that sector. There are higher tariffs, which could be addressed on defense and also energy. So the statements on LNG and crude oil exports from the United States. Frankly, I'm not sure of there being many trade restrictions that need to be addressed, but efforts on the part of the Indian government to increase purchases in those sectors likely would have a significant impact on the deficit, because that's the other side of the coin here. I mean, there's a real focus of the Trump administration on reciprocal tariffs and sectors where India has very high tariffs, but the other high priority is the trade deficit. And the bilateral trade deficit with India is not what it is with Mexico or Canada or the European Union. It's or Vietnam. It's smaller. It's less significant. But that will be part of the administration's talking points about addressing the trade deficit. And those two sectors, I think, could help that along quite a bit.
Mhm. And now coming to the China factor, Mr. Linscott, I know under the Biden administration, we were hearing a lot about something called a friendshoring, right? And, India was gearing up to be this China plus one strategy factor, which unfortunately did not work out. But Do you think there'll be pressure from the Trump administration for India to get its act together and be a viable alternative to China than what it is today? We are facing competition from Vietnam, Philippines, and others.
Yeah, I think the dynamic of friendshoring that really came to the forefront during the Biden administration, driven by the circumstances of COVID and the war in Ukraine, will continue in this Trump administration. There will be a general economic and strategic um, imperative to have trusted trading partners in key sectors, and India is really the obvious example of where it would be highly desirable. I'm not sure that it was unsuccessful during the Biden administration. I think that these movement of supply chains, particularly when so much manufacturing has been embedded in China, that takes time. It's not a matter of a year or a couple of years. So I think that is an ongoing process and likely will continue under the Trump administration. What a BTA can do to enhance that is to ease trade between the two countries, lower tariffs between the two countries, address some of the non-tariff barriers, including quality control orders that can restrict that trade, and U.S. measures as well. This will be it should be a two-way street in terms of a trade negotiation, and to the extent India has issues with barriers in the U.S. market, those could be addressed as well. So, I think that what a BTA can do is basically create a more favorable environment to enhance efforts on friendshoring, and over time we'll see more movement of manufacturing from China into India. Now, there's a big question about whether the U.S. might, or whether Trump himself might want to do a trade deal with China. And that's possible, but I think it would be limited, would probably be more focused on avoiding additional tariffs rather than eliminating the ones that have already been in place. And I don't think it would significantly slow down the effort to de-risk from the Chinese economy. I don't think we'll see a full delinking, but I think that process of de-risking from the China economy will continue, and India is well placed to benefit from that.
Mhm. Also, if I can ask you, since you are also now with the US-India Strategic Partnership Forum, the USISPF, I'm sure you address a lot of concerns raised by the American industry as far as, taxation and regulatory, kind of restrictions that are there in India. Do you think the BTA should be addressing that as well?
Yeah, in fact, well, I wear multiple hats, as a senior advisor with USISPF, and also the Asia Group, where I've been for the last 6 years since I left USTR, as well as the Atlantic Council. I spent a lot of time with industry, both Indian and U.S. Industry, and the industry representatives on both sides are, for the most part, very enthusiastic about the possibilities of a bilateral trade agreement. Frankly, there was a lot of disappointment about the lack of ambition generally on trade in the Biden administration. It was a bit surprising and unfortunate. I mean, the administration did a lot of good things, but on trade, its results were not very impressive. I think there is widely seen among industry on both sides as a real opportunity between the two with this bilateral trade agreement. The great thing was that it was done so quickly. I mean, only a month into the Trump administration, Prime Minister Modi came here and they committed to do this negotiation. And I think that puts India first in line to attract the attention and the resources from the U.S. side to get a focused negotiation and get some results as fast as possible.
Mhm. And my last question to you, Mr. Linscott, I know you're extremely busy. It's just early morning in Washington, D.C. What is it about reciprocal tariffs that, a normal Indian consumer should know? It's a heavy jargon as far as, trade is concerned. But when we talk about WTO, World Trade Organization, there is also this commentary that when you impose reciprocal tariff, that's a violation of WTO rules. So if you can explain to us a little bit that is it an era where the WTO would be sort of, fading away and the era of reciprocal tariffs is going to govern the trading rules?
Yeah, well, first of all, well, most of my career was multilateral. It was in Geneva, it was WTO. In fact, most of my experiences with India over many years, several decades, in fact, was negotiating multilaterally, and that was never very productive. We had limited results to show from those WTO negotiations. Frankly, have found that it's been much more constructive bilaterally between the United States and India. I mean, the WTO lacks relevance in a big way right now, and I don't see an obvious scenario in which that is going to change. I mean, for years now, trading partners have been going bilaterally or regionally outside the WTO. And, there are a number of reasons for that. And there's a fair share of blame to go around among the trading partners, the members of the WTO. Certainly, the entry of China into the WTO was a huge factor, where it was found that WTO rules, in fact, were not very effective in addressing non-market practices by China. The U.S. hasn't really helped things with basically making the appellate body and dispute settlement non-operable. That's been a huge hit to the WTO. But frankly, I think the biggest factor was the launch of the Doha round of negotiations. This was back in 2001, a huge agenda, perhaps an unrealistic agenda. It looked, in fact, quite like the Uruguay round, which barely got done. A key aspect of that being market access and tariffs, and probably the highest priority for the United States and for the European Union and many other countries was for the major developing countries, namely China, Brazil, and India, to engage in a real negotiation on tariffs. And that didn't happen. Frankly, those three and a few others were very wary about engaging on tariff cuts. And as a consequence, we do have the situation in which U.S. tariffs are very low. European tariffs, for the most part, are very low. Japanese tariffs are generally very low, but the major developing countries still have much higher tariffs. And that's what's generated, I think, so much of this blowback that we're seeing with the Trump administration. We heard Bob Lighthizer, who was the USTR when I was still there, who spoke about this constantly. I mean, his book is largely about that. The fact that there's just this disparity in tariffs, and that was a big factor in the WTO no longer having relevance. But again, blame can go around. I think almost all members did not give the WTO, the time and the effort and the priority to make it work into the 21st century.
That's true. And also, in 2013 ministerial, I understand there was still some hope that with the signing of the public food stockholding agreement, there will be some movement onwards. And there had been several US-India WTO disputes, which I think are now sort of, being sorted out bilaterally. But what do you make of the reciprocal tariffs? Is this going to be the future of, global trading rules?
I hope not, because I think taken to its extreme, it's very risky. Well, first of all, there are questions about how easily it can be administered, certainly on the US side. If we have a bespoke tariff schedule for every single trading partner on every single tariff line, that's just unworkable. I mean, it really doesn't make any sense. The administrative costs associated with that would be huge. The hit on, global GDP could potentially be huge. So, I taken to its extreme, I think it's a very bad scenario. However, if it is effective and used selectively and responsibly and successful in lowering some tariffs, some of the highest tariffs in some countries, that's not necessarily a bad thing. What it means in terms of the multilateral trading system and most favored nation treatment, non-discriminatory, is a big question. But if it is successful in lowering some tariffs, certainly for U.S. exporters, without igniting new trade wars, and that's the key question: can we avoid new trade wars? Nobody benefits from trade wars. Then maybe we can see some successes associated with that.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much for talking to us, Mr. Linscott. It's wonderful to speak to you and understand some of the trade dynamics that's going to play out between US and India. And thank you for giving us your time.
Well, thank you so much, Nayanima. It's great to see you again.
Thank you. Please take care.
Take care. Bye-bye.